Drops of fresh crimson stained the pristine kitchen floor of Boston's most exclusive restaurant. Upstairs, a billionaire who had not felt a heartbeat in 3 centuries inhaled sharply. His glowing eyes snapped toward the security monitors, locking onto a bruised, terrified woman. His order was absolute: bring her to me. Heat radiated from the industrial stoves, turning the kitchen of Veritas into a suffocating inferno. Clara Higgins stood over the stainless steel prep counter, her breathing heavy and labored. She was a large woman, undeniably fat, and she carried her weight with a mixture of quiet shame and stubborn resilience. Her chef's coat was a size too small, binding uncomfortably tightly across her broad shoulders and thick waist, a petty punishment from the general manager, Greg Trenton, who claimed ordering a custom size for a mere prep cook was a waste of the restaurant's budget. Sweat beaded on Clara's forehead, pasting strands of mousy brown hair to her skin as she meticulously sliced truffles for the evening's VIP guests. Tonight was not just any night. The owner of the restaurant, Dominic Rossi, was in the building. Rossi was a ghost in the culinary world, an elusive billionaire who owned properties across the globe, but rarely graced them with his physical presence. The entire staff was on edge, a frantic, vibrating tension humming through the air. Clara tried to make herself invisible, a survival tactic she had perfected over 28 years of being the largest girl in the room. Society had long ago taught her that her body was an invitation for ridicule, and Greg took every opportunity to reinforce that cruel lesson. He was a tall, wiry man with a vicious temper and a superiority complex prone to taking out his endless frustrations on the most vulnerable person in his vicinity. Tonight, that person was Clara. It happened in an instant. Clara was carrying a tray of impossibly fragile crystal glasses toward the staging area. Her thick thighs chafed under her heavy trousers, causing her to shift her weight awkwardly to avoid a puddle of condensation near the ice machine. Her non-slip shoes caught on a loose floor mat. Clara stumbled, her heavy frame pitching forward. She tried desperately to save the tray, but gravity was unforgiving. Glass shattered into 1,000 glittering shards against the imported Italian tile. The sharp, explosive sound brought the chaotic kitchen to a dead, horrifying halt. Greg materialized from the dining room doors, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You clumsy, pathetic cow," he roared, his voice slicing through the sudden silence. Clara scrambled to her knees, her plump hands trembling as she instinctively reached to gather the broken glass. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Trenton. The mat was loose. I just tripped." "Shut your mouth!" Greg lunged forward. Without a second thought, his heavy leather dress shoe connected brutally with Clara's ribs. The breath exploded from her lungs in a wet gasp. She collapsed sideways onto the hard floor, the jagged remnants of the crystal slicing deep into the fleshy palm of her hand and her forearm. Blood, bright hot and shockingly red, welled up instantly, spilling over her pale skin and dripping onto the white tiles. But Greg was not finished. Fueled by the immense pressure of the owner's presence and his own deep-seated cruelty, he grabbed Clara by the collar of her tight chef's coat, hauling her upper body off the ground. He struck her across the face, his heavy gold ring tearing the skin above her cheekbone. "You disgust me. You are a useless, bloated liability. Do you know how much those glasses cost?" He spat, shoving her backward. Her head cracked against the metal legs of the prep station. Clara lay there dizzy, her vision swimming with dark spots. Her soft, heavy body ached with a profound, radiating pain. Her blood pooled on the floor, the metallic scent of it rising into the stifling kitchen air. The other line cooks and servers stood frozen, their eyes averted, too terrified of losing their prestigious jobs to intervene. 3 floors above, in the soundproof, dimly lit VIP penthouse overlooking the Boston skyline, Dominic Rossi stopped mid-sentence. He was holding a glass of aged scotch, speaking with 2 highly influential city politicians. But suddenly the human voices faded into static. Dominic's head snapped toward the floor beneath him. To the politicians, Dominic was a striking, terrifyingly handsome Italian magnate in a bespoke suit. To the supernatural underworld, he was a centuries-old predator, the vampire king of the eastern seaboard. His senses, sharpened by 300 years of darkness, caught it. A scent. It was not just any blood. It was a fragrance so profoundly intoxicating, so overwhelmingly rich and ancient, that it hit his system like a physical blow. It smelled of wild honey, crushed iron, and a rare genetic lineage that had supposedly died out during the Salem witch trials. Dominic's eyes flashed from deep espresso brown to a terrifying luminescent crimson. He slammed his crystal glass onto the mahogany table, ignoring the startled muffled gasps of his guests and strode toward the bank of security monitors built into the far wall. His long, pale fingers danced across the control panels, switching the feed to the basement kitchen. The black and white screen illuminated the scene. He saw a wiry man standing over a large, crumpled woman. He saw the dark puddle spreading beneath her hand. He saw her shaking, her full, round face bruised and bleeding. A primal, violent roar echoed in the back of Dominic's throat, a sound no human could ever produce. The air in the penthouse plummeted in temperature, frost rapidly forming on the edges of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He pressed the intercom button, connecting directly to his private security chief, Thomas. "Mr. Rossi," Thomas's voice crackled through the speaker. Dominic's voice was a deadly, silken whisper that promised absolute slaughter. "There is an altercation in the kitchen. A man has struck one of the prep cooks. Apprehend him. Break his hands." He paused, his crimson eyes tracing the soft, frightened curves of the weeping woman on the monitor, feeling an inexplicable, violent possessiveness claw at his dead chest. "And the woman? Bring her to me." The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like an ascent to the gallows. Clara leaned heavily against the mirrored wall of the carriage, her thick arms wrapped protectively around her aching ribs. Thomas, a hulking man in a sharply tailored black suit, stood beside her in absolute silence. He had arrived in the kitchen just as Greg was raising his foot for another kick. True to his boss's terrifying orders, Thomas had intercepted Greg, snapping the manager's wrist with a sickening crunch before two other guards dragged the screaming man out the back alley. Thomas had then gently, almost reverently, helped Clara to her feet, wrapping a clean linen napkin tightly around her bleeding arm. Now the elevator chimed, the mahogany doors sliding open silently. "Right this way, Miss Higgins," Thomas murmured, his tone inexplicably deferential. Clara limped forward, her bloodied non-slip shoes leaving faint dark prints on the plush charcoal carpet. She felt massive, clumsy, and entirely out of place. The penthouse was a sprawling cavern of dark wood velvet and priceless art, smelling of expensive cologne and old books. She clutched the bloody linen to her chest, her round face flushed with humiliation and pain. Her cheek throbbed fiercely, her eye already swelling shut. She assumed the owner wanted to fire her personally to avoid a lawsuit. Dominic Rossi stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering lights of the city. As Clara stepped into the room, he turned. Clara's breath hitched. He was without exaggeration the most intimidatingly flawless man she had ever seen. Tall, broad-shouldered, with raven black hair and skin the color of pale marble. But it was his eyes that froze her in place. They were a deep, mesmerizing brown, yet in the low light they seemed to reflect an impossible, predatory red. "Leave us," Dominic commanded. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that sent a strange, involuntary shiver down Clara's spine. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her, leaving her utterly alone with the billionaire. Dominic closed the distance between them in a way that defied natural physics. One moment he was by the window, a second later he was standing mere inches from her. Clara instinctively flinched, curling her large body inward, expecting a blow, a harsh reprimand, a volley of insults about her weight and her clumsiness. Instead, Dominic dropped to one knee. Clara gasped, staring down in shock as this unimaginably powerful man knelt onto the expensive carpet, ruining the fabric of his trousers in the drops of her blood. He reached out his large, ice-cold hands, gently taking her thick, trembling arm. "You are shaking," Dominic observed, his eyes fixed on the bloody linen. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rossi. I'm so sorry," Clara stammered, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "I'll pay for the glasses. I know I'm a mess. I'm so fat and clumsy. Greg is right. Do not speak his name," Dominic interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, echoing with a dangerous, unnatural resonance that vibrated in Clara's chest. He looked up at her, his gaze sweeping over her full figure, not with the disgust she was accustomed to, but with a burning, ancient reverence. "And never insult yourself in my presence again. You are magnificent." Clara let out a choked, disbelieving sob. Nobody had ever called her magnificent. Dominic carefully unwrapped the bloody linen from her arm. As the deep gash on her forearm was exposed, the sweet metallic scent of her blood hit the air again in full force. Dominic's breath hitched, his gums ached, his fangs pushing against his lips, desperate to descend. The scent confirmed his suspicion. Clara was a carrier of the sanguis dulcis, a bloodline born of a rare mutation from centuries past, capable of grounding a vampire, healing their oldest wounds, and binding them to a single mate. She was entirely unaware of the treasure running through her veins. "Your hand is like ice," Clara whispered, her fear momentarily eclipsed by confusion as his long fingers caressed the uninjured skin of her wrist. "I am going to heal you," Clara Dominic said softly. He brought her bleeding forearm toward his face. Before Clara could pull away, Dominic's lips brushed against her skin. A sharp, momentary prick pierced the flesh near her wound, followed instantly by a wave of intense euphoric warmth. Clara gasped, her eyes rolling back slightly as a rush of impossible pleasure swept through her heavy, aching body. The pain in her ribs vanished. The stinging in her cheek melted away. Dominic's tongue bathed the wound, his saliva possessing ancient regenerative properties. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the taste of her. It was like drinking liquid starlight. He felt the heavy, suffocating darkness that had haunted his soul for 300 years shatter into dust. This beautifully soft, round woman was not just a prep cook, she was his salvation. He pulled back slowly, forcing himself to stop before he drained her. Clara stared at her arm in absolute horror and awe. The deep gash was gone. Only a faint pink line remained on her pale skin. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, the tight chef's coat straining against her ample curves. She finally saw the elongated canines resting against his bottom lip. The realization hit her, paralyzing her mind. "What are you?" Clara breathed, backing away slowly until her heavy hips hit the edge of a mahogany desk. Dominic rose to his full, imposing height. He did not hide what he was. He stepped into the light, letting her see the predatory grace, the unearthly stillness of his chest that neither rose nor fell with breath. "I am a monster," Clara Dominic said softly, his crimson eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "A monster who has waited 3 lifetimes for you to walk into my kitchen, and I promise you the man who laid his hands on you tonight will never see the dawn." Fear paralyzed Clara, her large frame frozen against the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. Her mind fiercely rejected the impossibility of the last 5 minutes, yet her eyes could not deny the elongated fangs resting against Dominic Rossi's lower lip. He stood before her, a creature pulled directly from the pages of Gothic folklore, possessing a lethal grace that made the air in the penthouse crackle with static electricity. She glanced down at her arm. The jagged, bloody gash was entirely gone, replaced by a smooth expanse of pale, untouched skin. You drank my blood," Clara stammered, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the central air conditioning. She wrapped her thick arms tightly around her stomach, an instinctual gesture of self-protection she had utilized since childhood. Dominic's expression softened, the terrifying, luminescent crimson in his eyes receding into a pool of warm, deeply human espresso brown. "I tasted it," he corrected gently, taking a slow, deliberate step back to give her space. "If I had truly drank Clara, neither of us would be standing here right now. Your scent, it is something out of legend, a lineage the supernatural world believed to be entirely extinct." He gestured toward a plush velvet sofa in the center of the room. "Please sit. You have endured a severe physical trauma regardless of the healing. You need a moment to process." Clara hesitated, her non-slip shoes feeling ridiculously heavy. She felt like an absolute imposter in this palace of wealth. She slowly walked toward the sofa and sat down, wincing slightly as her bruised ribs, though mostly healed, still pulsed with the phantom memory of Greg's brutal kick. Dominic moved to an antique wet bar tucked into the corner of the room. He poured a glass of amber liquid, not the aged scotch from earlier, but a rare honey-infused bourbon. He brought it to her, his icy fingers brushing hers as she took the crystal tumbler. "Drink. It will calm your nerves," he instructed softly. Clara took a sip, the fiery liquid burning a pleasant trail down her throat. She looked around the cavernous room, her eyes landing on a massive painting hung behind Dominic's desk. Her breath hitched. She was no art historian, but she recognized the frantic, dark brushstrokes of the maritime scene. "Is that the storm on the Sea of Galilee?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "The Rembrandt that was stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum 30 years ago." A faint, genuinely amused smile tugged at the corner of Dominic's mouth. 36 years ago, to be precise. "And it was not stolen, my dear. It was reclaimed. Isabella was a dear friend of mine in the late 19th century. I merely took back what I had gifted her after the museum failed to properly secure it." The casual drop of a real-life historical figure and an unsolved federal crime made Clara's head spin even faster. She took another gulp of the bourbon. "You knew Isabella Stewart Gardner? You own a stolen Rembrandt. You own this restaurant. And you are a vampire. Yes, to you all," Dominic replied, lowering his large frame into the armchair opposite her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze intensely focused on her round, flushed face. "But none of those facts matter tonight. What matters is that you were harmed in my establishment. What matters is that you carry the sanguis dulcis." "The what?" Clara asked, looking down at her stained, tight chef's coat, suddenly acutely aware of how her belly pressed against the fabric. She tried to pull the coat down to hide her curves. "The sweet blood," Dominic translated softly, noticing her movement and frowning slightly. "It is a rare genetic mutation. To my kind, it is the ultimate anchor. It has the power to heal our deepest, most ancient wounds, and to bind a vampire to their true mate, grounding their humanity. Wars were fought over women with your bloodline in the 16th century. Clara let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh, the sound bitter and hollow in the opulent room. "War's over me. Mr. Rossi, look at me. I'm a 28-year-old prep cook who lives in a studio apartment in Southie. I wear a size 22. I'm fat, I'm clumsy, and an hour ago I was getting kicked into a prep station because I tripped over my own feet. Nobody is fighting wars over me." Dominic's eyes flared crimson again, a low, dangerous rumble echoing in his chest. He stood up, crossing the space between them in the blink of an eye. He knelt before her once more, his large hands reaching out to gently cup her thick thighs, his thumbs resting on the rough fabric of her trousers. Clara gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Never belittle yourself," Dominic commanded, his voice a silken, absolute decree. "Human society's standards of beauty are a fleeting modern sickness. In the Renaissance, in the courts of real kings and queens, a woman of your substance, your softness, your abundance was worshipped as the pinnacle of divine fertility and grace. To me, you are a masterpiece, far more valuable than the Rembrandt hanging on that wall." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. The sincerity in his ancient gaze was unmistakable. He was not mocking her. He was devouring her with his eyes, seeing a goddess where the modern world saw a flaw. Before she could respond, the heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse swung open. Thomas stood in the threshold, his usually stoic face grim. "So forgive the intrusion," Thomas said, his eyes briefly flicking to Clara with an expression of deep concern. "We have a catastrophic breach." Dominic stood slowly, placing himself protectively between Clara and the doorway. "Report." Greg Trenton, Thomas growled, spitting the name out like poison. Before we could fully secure him, he managed to send a text to a contact in the underworld. He told them he found a bleeding girl in the kitchen who smelled like crushed iron and wild honey. The message was intercepted by the Mercer Syndicate. Dominic's jaw clenched, a terrifying, predatory stillness overtaking his body. Caleb Mercer was a vicious, power-hungry vampire lord who controlled the ports of Boston, a rival who had spent decades trying to unseat Dominic. "They know she is here," Thomas finished grimly, "and they are already in the elevator." Chaos erupted in the span of a single heartbeat. The security alarms of the penthouse screamed to life, a blaring red-tinted siren that shattered the tranquil illusion of the billionaire's sanctuary. Clara scrambled backward on the velvet sofa, her heavy heart pounding furiously against her ribs as the reality of the supernatural underworld crashed down upon her. "Thomas, secure the perimeter. No one enters this room," Dominic roared, his bespoke suit jacket ripping at the seams as his shoulders broadened, his body physically responding to the impending violence. The heavy oak doors slammed shut as Thomas rushed back into the hallway, leaving Clara isolated with the Vampire King. Dominic turned to her, his face a terrifying mask of ancient, unbridled fury. His fangs were fully descended, gleaming sharply in the red light of the alarm system. "Stay behind the desk, Clara. Do not make a sound," he ordered, his voice echoing with a dark, commanding resonance that left no room for argument. Clara did not hesitate. Despite her size, adrenaline fueled her movements. She threw her heavy body behind the solid oak desk, pulling her knees to her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to drown out the sounds of the brutal slaughter occurring just beyond the penthouse doors. She heard the sickening crunch of bone, the tearing of flesh, and a series of inhuman guttural snarls that sounded like wild animals fighting over fresh meat. Suddenly, the floor-to-ceiling window behind her shattered inward. Clara screamed as a shower of thick tempered glass rained down across the mahogany floor. A figure dropped from the rooftop above, landing with a heavy, sickening thud right in the center of the room. It was Caleb Mercer. He was unnervingly slender, dressed in a sharp leather trench coat, his face twisted into a cruel, arrogant smirk. His eyes burned with a sickly yellow luminescence. "Well, well," Caleb sneered, dusting a shard of glass from his shoulder. He took a deep, theatrical breath, his nostrils flaring. Trenton wasn't lying. The sweet blood. It's intoxicating. A sanguis dulcis, right here in Boston. Caleb's yellow eyes locked onto the desk. He moved with a speed that defied logic, instantly materializing beside Clara. He grabbed her by the collar of her tight chef's coat and hauled her massive frame upward with terrifying, effortless strength. Clara kicked and thrashed her heavy, non-slip shoes connecting with Caleb's shins, but it was like kicking solid granite. Caleb laughed a dry, rasping sound. "Feisty, aren't we? And so wonderfully soft." Caleb mocked his cold fingers, digging into the plump flesh of her cheek. "Dominic has kept all the good things for himself for far too long. Your blood will make my syndicate invincible. But first, let's see if you taste as good as you smell." He opened his jaws wide, aiming for her exposed throat. Survival instinct honed by a lifetime of pushing through adversity flared within Clara. She wasn't just a victim. She was strong. She reached out her thick fingers, blindly grasping at the edge of the desk. Her hand closed around the heavy, solid brass base of an antique lamp. With a fierce, guttural cry, Clara swung her arm with all her immense weight and strength, smashing the brass base directly into the side of Caleb's skull. The vampire stumbled, caught completely off guard by the sheer physical force of the blow. His grip loosened, and Clara dropped to the floor, gasping for air. Before Caleb could recover and retaliate, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse exploded inward, ripped completely off their steel hinges. Dominic Rossi stood in the doorway, drenched in the blood of Caleb's mercenaries. He looked like a god of war, a terrifying embodiment of death. He saw Caleb standing near Clara, and the entire penthouse seemed to vibrate with Dominic's rage. Dominic whispered the sound more terrifying than any scream. In a blur of motion too fast for Clara's human eyes to track, Dominic crossed the room. He slammed into Caleb, driving the rival vampire backward until they crashed through the shattered window frame, dangling over the terrifying drop to the Boston streets below. Dominic's hands clamped around Caleb's throat. "You dared to touch what is mine," Dominic snarled, his fangs sinking deep into the side of Caleb's neck, tearing through the flesh. With a brutal, fluid twist of his powerful shoulders, Dominic snapped Caleb's neck, tossing the rival lord's limp body out into the dark night sky. The penthouse fell completely silent, save for the wailing of the wind whipping through the broken window. Dominic turned back toward the room. His chest heaved, his face smeared with crimson. He looked like a monster. He expected Clara to run, to scream, to look at him with the same disgust and terror she had faced from men like Greg Trenton. Instead, Clara slowly pulled herself up from the floor. Her chef's coat was torn, her hair was a wild mess, and she was shaking, but her eyes held an unprecedented quiet strength. She walked toward him, her heavy steps crunching over the broken glass. She stopped right in front of the Vampire King, reaching out a plump, trembling hand to wipe a smear of blood from his pale cheek. "Are you hurt?" she asked softly. Dominic's breath caught in his throat. He leaned into her soft touch, closing his eyes as a profound sense of peace washed over his ancient, violent soul. He wrapped his long arms around her thick waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of wild honey and iron. "I have wandered in the dark for 300 years, Dominic murmured against her skin, his voice thick with emotion. "I am never letting you go, Clara Higgins. You are my queen, my sanctuary, and my eternal mate. Anyone who ever makes you feel less than magnificent will meet the same fate as the trash I threw out that window." Clara rested her head against his broad chest, finally feeling entirely safe, entirely seen, and unconditionally cherished. In the heart of the bloody penthouse, surrounded by stolen art and shattered glass, the prep cook and the Vampire King forged a bond that the shadows of Boston would never break. What an explosive conclusion. From a brutal kitchen floor to the bloody, shattered windows of a billionaire's penthouse, Clara discovered her ultimate worth in the arms of the ultimate predator. Did Clara's fierce bravery surprise you? If this dark, thrilling twist on vampire romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Share this video with a friend who loves supernatural drama, and subscribe for more intense, heart-pounding stories where the underdog always wins.